welcome to Slavery and Its Legacies, a podcast of the Gilder Lehrman Center for the Study of Slavery, Resistance, and Abolition. Slavery and Its Legacies interviews visiting scholars, activists, and others about their contributions to the understanding of slavery, past and present, and its ongoing role in the development of the modern world. Well, welcome again. I'm David Blight. This is the Gilder Lehrman Center for the Study of Slavery and Abolition's occasional podcasts. We're calling these the COVID-19 Conversations. And I am personally thrilled today to have as a guest Carol Anderson. Carol has written many books, and I'll name them in a moment. She's a good friend. Carol is a distinguished professor at Emory University, where she's Charles Howard Candler Professor and chair of the African American Studies Department. She has written 4 major books, and there's another new one on the way, which we might get to discuss. Her first book was called Eyes Off the Prize: The United Nations and the African American Struggle for Human Rights in the post-World War II era. A second book called Bourgeois Radicals: The NAACP and the Struggle for Colonial Liberation from 1941 to 1960. So Carol has really established her chops in international history and foreign policy history. Then she wrote the book White Rage, which became a New York Times bestseller. White Rage: The Unspoken Truth of Our Racial Divide. A book all the more suddenly timely in this moment. It was on a number of 100 best books for the year, and as I said, a bestseller. She's also done a young adult adaptation of that book. And then finally, the book we're going to talk mostly about today, One Person, No Vote: How Voter Suppression is Destroying Our Democracy. It is the book on voter suppression now, and I highly recommend it. I'll even show it, by God. It's been out for a while. It's an important study, especially of the recent modern efforts. And let's face it, this is not a bipartisan story. It is the efforts of the modern Republican Party for now 2 decades at least, to suppress the votes of Black and brown Americans, young Americans, older Americans. And what Carol does in this book is lays out first a pretty deep history of where this comes from, and then particularly zeroes in on the post-2010, the post-election of Barack Obama period, and the various machinations from voter ID laws to gerrymandering to purging of voting rolls and many other methods that have been used in voter suppression. Voter suppression is so often a word, an idea that's thrown around out there. Does it exist or doesn't it exist? You cannot read any part of One Person, No Vote and still believe it doesn't exist. That's a little bit like climate change in that sense. People still somehow have to be convinced of this. So, Carol, welcome to this podcast, and thank you for doing this.
Thank you so much for inviting me, David. I'm looking forward to our conversation.
So am I. Let's start with some history. This is a very old history, as you and I both know, beginning at least with Reconstruction, when Blacks were, of course, voting in large numbers and registering in large numbers. And then right on through the era of Jim Crow, where we had all kinds of methods of voter suppression. Let's do a little background on that. How can you capture the early history of this phenomenon when it was, frankly, much more explicit, usually, and more violent? Help us out with it.
And I think one of the key to understand is the Mississippi Plan of 1890. Because what the Mississippi State Legislature did was they were concerned about the growing political power of the Black vote and how it could transform the state of Mississippi. Because there weren't just a few Black folk in Mississippi, there were a lot of Black folk in Mississippi. And so Mississippi state legislature was like, how do we stop Black people from voting? And then this was the caveat, without writing a law saying we don't want Black people to vote.
Right.
Because there's this thing called the 15th Amendment that came out of Reconstruction that says the state shall not abridge the right to vote on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. So when you've got this constitutional amendment now sitting there, so what Mississippi came up with, and this is why this is so important, because this is what we're dealing with today, is they said, we are going to use the societally imposed conditions on Black people and make those conditions the access to the ballot box. And we're going to make it all sound reasonable and rational and democratically based. But what it is designed to do is to throttle democracy. So for instance, the poll tax. The Mississippi said, well, you know, democracy is expensive. You have these elections, you got to have people taking the votes, you got to have people counting the votes, you got to have people, you know, places where the votes are. It's just, if you really believed in democracy, you would be willing to pay a small fee, a small tax, as it were, in order to keep democracy going. So part of what you see there is the kind of legerdemain, the gymnastics that flips the onus of the responsibility of voting onto the individual and not the state. If you really believed, you'd be willing to pay a small fee. Now, after you have a community that's dealt with hundreds of years of slavery, of unpaid labor, and then you get the Black codes coming out of the Civil War, then you get sharecropping coming out of that period, you have societally imposed endemic, systemic poverty. So to look at this population and say, all you have to do is pay a small fee, it sounds reasonable until you realize it isn't. It amounted to somewhere between 2 to 6% of the annual farm family's income
to vote
in order to pay this fee. 2 to 6% of your annual income. And it was cumulative.
Oh, so if you didn't pay last year, you had to pay twice this year.
Yes. And you know, and if it takes you about 20 years.
They thought of everything.
They thought of everything. So then you owe 20 years of back poll taxes before you can vote. Yeah. And so, but and the Supreme Court said, well, everybody's got to pay, so it's race neutral enough. So it doesn't violate the 15th Amendment.
Right.
You get the same thing with the literacy test. When you have systematically denied education, and then you had the enslaved who were killed for daring to learn how to read.
Right.
Then you have the systematic underfunding of Black schools.
Yeah.
But you say, you know, we want, in order to make sure we have a strong electorate, that we wipe out this kind of corruption at the ballot box, we need to make sure that we have an electorate who understands our values.
Corruption equals illiteracy equals poverty. It all goes together, and therefore they should not vote.
Exactly. And so the literacy test only required that you read a section of the Constitution and interpret it. So, and again, the Supreme Court said, it's race neutral, everybody's got to read it.
Right.
So when you're not looking at the underlying systemic conditions and you're only looking at the language itself, these things are flying through as not in violation of the 15th.
Interesting how much this story and the way you develop it reminds us that millions of Americans, white Southerners in particular in the Reconstruction and early Jim Crow era, but millions of others as well, did not actually accept the 14th and 15th Amendments. We celebrate the 14th and 15th Amendments, and rightly so. They transformed the US Constitution. But there were great numbers of people who never accepted them. And so this idea of the 15th Amendment, you know, what you do is you work around it.
Exactly.
It's just bad law to them. you just work around it. You find some way around it, including these things called grandfather clauses, which when you try to explain it to undergraduate students, they think, huh?
You're like,
how did that work? Because that became a real tool in some states by 1900.
right. So what the grandfather clause was designed to do was to find a way to capture those poor whites that they wanted to vote, who were having trouble navigating the poll tax and trouble navigating the literacy test.
Yeah.
And so it said, if your grandfather could vote before like 1866, or 18, then you too can vote. Well, the problem is,
it's not the least bit subtle. I mean, it's
right? You know, so we've got the 1867 Reconstruction Act that basically says Black men can vote. Prior to that time, you had 4 million enslaved people. So many African Americans' grandfathers could not vote.
Yeah.
So it was a way of creating a racial barrier to the ballot box without saying, we don't want Black people to vote. Yeah. And it took the Supreme Court 25 years to knock down the grandfather clause.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and let's talk a little bit here before we get to the deep subject of your book, which is our own time. Let's talk a little bit about violence too. Voting was so threatening, so important, so powerful in Reconstruction. Black folk did begin to vote. Black men voted in huge numbers in 1868 and again in 1872. And indeed helped get Ulysses Grant elected president, and hundreds of Black men into state houses and in the U.S. Congress. It became such a threat that eventually violence became one of the most effective means of voter suppression of all. I mean, we should rehearse a little bit of that, because it happened all over the place.
It happened all over the place, and it happened all the way up until we're getting into the middle of the 20th century. So we have to understand that you have the policies that are in place to stop Black people from voting. And it is coupled with state-sanctioned or condoned violence against Black voters. Yeah. So that you had things called dead books. So the listing of Black people's names who were trying to vote, and they were going around going, you know, your name is basically, it was a hit list. Yeah. So you know your name is on a hit list if you dare vote. Yeah. You had the kind of violence that would wipe out entire communities, like in Wilmington, North Carolina, like in Ocoee, Florida in 1920, because somebody dared vote. You had the massacre at Colfax, Louisiana in 1873. That was because there was an election that whites did not agree with because Republicans won. And so you had Black militia trying to protect the results of a democratically elected government, and whites came in and slaughtered them. And
execution style.
Oh, it was awful. Yeah. It was awful.
You know, today, if one person were shot and killed at a voting poll, I mean, literally at the poll on election day, it would probably shut down the election in that town. It would be national news immediately. We need the public to understand that during the Reconstruction years, this happened on a regular basis. It was a normal part of politics.
Absolutely. We see this throughout the South. And you know, one of the stories that I tell is the story coming in 1946.
World War II, that's right, yeah.
Right, so after World War II, and you know, so after the U.S. has helped defeat the Nazis, and a man named Maceo Snipes, who was a Black World War II veteran, comes home to Georgia. In Taylor County, Georgia, and he is determined to vote because there is an election going on with Eugene Talmadge running for governor. And he's running on a platform, you keep the right where they belong. He's all about, you know, how do we keep Black people away from the ballot box. Maceo Snipes comes through and he decides he's going to vote.
Yeah.
And there's a sign over the precinct that says something to the effect of, the first Negro that votes, that'll be the last thing he ever does. And Maceo looks at that, he's like, I fought fascists. And so he goes in, he casts his ballot, he leaves, and nothing happens. And he's like, okay. A few days later, though, there's a knock at the door. He steps out on the porch, and it's a firing squad. And Maceo was the only Black person to vote in Taylor County in 1946.
Yeah.
It sent the message, you vote, you die.
Yeah. Nothing subtle about those methods.
Nothing subtle. So you mix in the poll tax, the literacy test. There was a thing called the white primary that the U.S. Supreme Court had just ruled unconstitutional in 1944, but the southern states were figuring out how to get around that as well. So you mix in all of these policies of massive disfranchisement, layered in with the violence. And so by the time we're looking up into the early 1960s, there were only, in Mississippi, only about 5% of African Americans were registered to vote in 1960 or so.
Whereas something like 70% had been registered at the peak of Reconstruction, right?
Yeah, I mean, yes, I mean, it just, you can see the power of disfranchisement. What you're looking in Alabama, in Lowndes County, for instance, 0% of African Americans were registered to vote, but over 100% of whites were registered to vote.
Over 100. No, you have to laugh. I mean, it's like, yeah.
And so this is what is fueling movement. This is what leads us to the cataclysm on the Edmund Pettus Bridge. And that will eventually lead us into the Voting Rights Act of 1965.
Yeah, and it is so important to understand during the half century of the Jim Crow, or more than that, 60 years of the official Jim Crow system in the South, segregation was many, many different things. I mean, it was a system of ideas, a system of assumptions, a system of space, a system of the economic systems that locked these jobs away for white people and those jobs for Black people. But at its core, it was the elimination of Black people from civic life and political life, so that they would still remain a labor force, but never achieve any legitimate power. And then at the core, as you just suggested, of the civil rights movement, we're again conquering segregation in all of its forms, including schools. But it was the right to vote. And the famous Selma March and the Pettus Bridge March was about the right to vote in 1965. And that transformed the country, at least for a while.
So I talked about Mississippi. So we're looking in early 1960s, Mississippi, 5% African Americans voting age eligible African Americans registered to vote. By 1967, 2 years after the passage of the Voting Rights Act, it was almost 60% of African Americans registered to vote in Mississippi. And what made the Voting Rights Act so landmark was that it did a preemptive strike. First, it said, if you have fewer than 50% of your voting age eligible adults registered to vote, that's like the canary in the mine. Something's up if you've got fewer than 50% across the board. There's something smelling. Then the next piece was that if you used one of these devices from the Mississippi plan, that really we know who you are. And so that's how these states and these jurisdictions got covered under the Voting Rights Act, which said that any change that they wanted to make to their voting laws, they could not implement them unless it had been okayed first by the U.S. Department of Justice or by the federal courts in DC.
That's what was known as pre-clearance, right?
Pre-clearance.
It had to be cleared by federal officials.
Federal officials first. And so as federal officials are going through these laws, they're like, oh my God. And, and so we saw the initial challenge coming out in 1966 with South Carolina, where South Carolina wanted to have literacy tests. Well, come on. And they resented having federal electors at the polls to make sure that Black folks weren't given literacy tests. And so South Carolina sued saying, the Voting Rights Act is unconstitutional because it violates states' rights.
Oh yeah, that was always the taint, more than a taint. I mean, it was the cause of great resistance to it.
Absolutely. And the Supreme Court, this is when we had a real one, came back and said, no son, no son, no son. So then Virginia and Mississippi tried, and they thought that they would be a little more subtle than South Carolina.
Right.
They thought that what they were tweaking wasn't exactly blocking people from the polls like a literacy test, but were just little tweaks in the laws. For instance, that positions like the school superintendent that used to be an elected position was now going to be an appointed position. Things like that.
Did they even use something called, I didn't know about this, I read it in your book, something called re-registration schemes? You not only had to be registered, but you had to re-register to establish your address or something. If you had re-registered, you couldn't vote?
Right. And then that re-registration was a way to knock people off of the rolls who had managed to get on the rolls. I mean, all this kind of chicanery. And the US Supreme Court said, stop it. No, the voting rights applies to the subtle, the corrosive, as well as to the big stuff. Any voting law change you want to make has to come through the DOJ. It was landmark. And so when you see what the Shelby County v. Holder decision did in 2013.
Yes. I want to get to that, Carol, because that's absolutely crucial. It's a turning point in your book. It's a turning point, frankly, in modern political history.
Yeah.
But just for a moment on that issue of federal and state power, I mean, it's crucial, isn't it, that if we really want to understand this eternal issue of federalism in America, it isn't just a conceptual question. It isn't just a philosophical constitutional question. It has a real history.
Yes.
And for those people, and let's face it, African Americans, I think, disproportionately do tend to have a certain confidence in federal power, well, at least during some presidencies and some times, because of this history.
Exactly.
Without federal authority on these issues, there was no protection. That's what the civil rights movement, among other things, tells us. I mean, it's really, and that clause in the Voting Rights Act, there was always resistance to, wasn't there? First in the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, into the 20th century, and they kept renewing it. It had to be renewed. I don't know, what is it, every 10 years, every 5 years?
Well, at first it was every 5 years.
Oh, okay.
And then it expanded to like 25 years or so. But what was so interesting about this landmark legislation was that the only way to really get it through was to put a renewal reauthorization clause in there.
Oh, that was in the original to get some people to vote for it.
Yes.
Oh, I didn't realize that. Whoa, interesting.
Yeah.
Interesting.
I mean, the Voting Rights Act has been a long, hard-fought battle. Water.
Go ahead. Well, that brings us then, if you don't mind, to at least the Bush years. That's the George W. Bush years. And I'm aware that there's been a lot of George W. Bush revisionism of late and so forth. And I'm not targeting him per se, but the current efforts of voter suppression really do begin then, don't they? With the Bush Department of Justice run by John Ashcroft. This was in the wake of Bush v. Gore itself. An interesting story of voter suppression. or just, yeah, a voter suppression, particularly in Florida. But in the Ashcroft DOJ, in that first Bush administration, they had a whole division, the Civil Rights Division, was it not? Explain that. They were kind of turned into a crusade to find voter fraud.
Right. I mean, so and so let me back up to that 2000 election to explain how this happened.
Sure,
This
please.
is why I love history. I love
That's ancient history to our undergraduates now.
So in that election, we often focus in on Florida, you know, with the hanging chads and the recount that the U.S. Supreme Court came in and stopped. But the language of voter fraud really, truly emerged out of Missouri. And the battle in St. Louis, where the Board of Elections had illegally purged almost 50,000 voters off of the rolls and didn't tell them. So people were coming to the polls to vote in November of 2000, and their names aren't on the rolls anywhere. And the phone lines are jammed. So poll workers are just sending all of these people downtown. And the Board of Elections records are a hot mess. And so people are frittering away hours downtown just so that they can get back on the rolls to vote. So by about...
And how many people can afford to do that? I mean,
and see, because when you're dealing with working class folk who have to punch a clock in order to get paid. So people are losing a day's wage. This is a poll tax. So the Democratic Party sues to have the polls open for 3 hours longer so that they don't close at 7, but they close at 10. The judge agreed and said, wow, because this isn't their fault. This isn't the voters' fault. The Republicans came in immediately after that and got another judge to say that the polls needed to be closed. And so they closed the polls at 7:45. Now, the language that the Republicans used was that we've got to close the polls because we've got all this massive, rampant voter fraud. We have all of these people who are using addresses from vacant lots and coming in over and over and over. They're trying to steal the election. We've got dogs on the voter rolls. We've got dead people on the voter rolls. And you have, let's be really clear, you have the respectable members of society saying this. You have U.S. Senator Kit Bond, who is really hammering this home. Bond takes this language, this lie of voter fraud. The St. Louis Post-Dispatch did a study and found that all of the charges were just a bunch of hot mess. There was one dog on the roll named Ritzy Meckler, but Ritzy didn't vote. There was a dead person on the roll, no
but
evidence.
You can't tell Kit Bond that. He still believes it, doesn't he?
And so the so-called vacant lots, almost 90% of them actually had homes on them. The city just hadn't updated its records. So all of the massive rampant voter fraud was a lie, but they took the lie. He took the lie into Congress with the Help America Vote Act, which was supposed to address all of the concerns of that 2000 election. So you took the reality of what happened in Florida, blended with the lie of what happened in Missouri, and you put them on equal plane in federal law, which then gave legitimacy to the lie of voter fraud. This is how we start getting voter ID and this hunt for all this voter fraud.
So that's the template for when Ashcroft's Department of Justice creates this whole division of lawyers tasked with literally finding cases of all this fraud.
Yes.
And in the end, they couldn't find any.
They couldn't find it. They could not find it.
And they had to kind of fold up shop, didn't they?
And they're pounding on U.S. attorneys. Like, you're not looking hard enough. You're not looking hard enough. And these U.S. And, so there was one U.S. attorney in, let's say, Arizona or New Mexico, who they wanted him to to charge a family because a 12-year-old was registered to vote. But it turned out that the 12-year-old didn't do it, the father didn't do it, the mother didn't do it. So why are you charging folks who didn't do it with it? But they needed to have a scapegoat. And when he refused, they fired him. So a series of U.S. attorneys were fired because they would not create the smokescreen, the Hollywood sound set to give some kind of depth to the lie.
That's a brilliant part of your book, if you don't mind me saying it. The way you demonstrate how this lie became reality to hosts of people, millions of people, and how it became this internal Justice Department political legal crusade to find something that just wasn't there. I also like the way you point out their Orwellian language. Not only does Kit Bond call his bill Help America Vote Act, but everything they were doing was always about the integrity of the ballot, integrity of the ballot, integrity of the ballot. And if you say something like that long enough, in enough ways and enough places with enough anecdotes, it's real.
Yes. And so you've got this
in the minds of people it becomes
in the minds of people it's real. So you in fact have an entire organization that is created on a website that then has its official director being called in to testify to Congress over and over and over about massive rampant voter fraud. Again, using actual legitimate organizations to create the illusion of legitimacy and validity, when in fact it is nothing but a script.
And wasn't the Bush administration in effect pushing toward a repeal of the Voting Rights Act if they could pull it off? But in the end, of course, because this effort failed to find anything, they had to themselves get behind renewal.
And so part of what happened there,
like 06 or 08, I forget which.
So in 2004, there was this kind of looking up and seeing how the demographics of the Republican Party had really shifted to being vast, overwhelmingly white.
Right.
But the demographics of the nation had not shifted to being vast and overwhelmingly white. And so they went okay, if we're going to survive this, we are going to have to broaden our policies. And so you saw Bush making two key efforts. One was backing the Voting Rights Act, and the other one was immigration reform. Lord, I mean, he
even showed up at the NAACP finally to speak there after refusing to go for 4 times.
So this was all of okay, we have got to broaden the appeal of the Republican Party, or we're going to be extinct. And the response from the base was, we're going to have to find another way. And so you see this kind of digging down where the Republicans had before them, as they're looking at a kind of demographic apocalypse, they have before them, okay, we can either reform and not be so right-wing that we are absolutely repulsive to the majority of Americans, or we can work to shut off access to the ballot box to those that we know will not consistently vote for us. And I go back to 1980 and Paul Weyrich, who was the co-founder of the Heritage Foundation, where he gives that talk before a group of religious leaders. And he says, some of you, you believe in good government, you're just goo-goos, because, you want everybody to vote. Well, I don't want everybody to vote. Because in fact, our leverage goes up as the voting populace goes down.
And you quote him explicitly saying that publicly, way back then.
Way back then. And when you think about the template of voter suppression, that's it. Our power, our leverage goes up as the voting populace goes down. And I
think that's the crucial thing to understand for people who still don't have their heads around this voter suppression yet, it comes from this basic realization, actually, long ago, as you point out, 1980, for Republicans, for Republican operatives, their future depends on maximization of white voters and the minimization or elimination of the vote of black, brown, young people who tend to vote Democratic. That is their way to power and way to survive. That's what drives this. It's the impulse behind this.
Absolutely. And so we see that drive then really coming to the fore in the moment that we're in now. And it was the Shelby County v. Holder decision that brought us here. So when we understand the context, the other piece of the context is the election of Barack Obama.
Absolutely. I was just going to ask you, you're right. I mean, that was a catastrophe, really, for Republicans, because Obama in 2008 brought how many million new voters? I forget.
15 million.
Yeah. Phenomenal. New voters who had never voted before.
Exactly. And they were overwhelmingly African American, Hispanic, Asian American, young, and poor.
Right.
This would become the hit list for voter suppression.
Yeah.
Because it was like, oh, you see how these folks are voting? So what you would think would happen in a democracy is that you would embrace the fact that 15 million new people saw themselves as having a stake in this nation.
Except for the instinct of power in a democracy.
Except for, right? And so
that's why we have constitutions, actually. But that's right.
Because you see this thing happening where they're chomping at the bit. Let me explain. Because we know we're talking about Shelby County v. Holder in 2013.
Right.
But in 2011, the state of Alabama passed a voter ID law. Because remember, it was embedded in federal law back then, sanctioned in the mid 2000s. And so what Alabama did, and the Republicans recorded themselves as they were working on another bill, but this gives you the framing. Mm-hmm. How do we depress the Black voter turnout? Mm-hmm. Because all of these Aborigines and these illiterates will get on these HUD finance buses and go to the polls.
And that's a quote. You quote people saying that.
That's
right.
A quote.
I know.
It just, and so when that is a legislator's frame, how do we depress the Black voter turnout? And then think about the horrific ways that this legislator's Black citizens, American citizens, are construed. Yeah. And so they crafted a voter ID law that they knew that they could not get through the U.S. Department of Justice because it was so racist. But after Shelby County v. Holder, boom, that law came into being.
Yeah, which was a 5-4 decision, right? With John Roberts writing the majority opinion, I believe.
Yes.
And what did explain that a bit? What did he argue, actually? Because it overturns the voting rights, particularly the pre-clearance clause, right?
Yeah, it gets rid of Section 4, which is the clause that defines what it takes to come under pre-clearance. So if you get rid of that clause, then Section 5, which is then what happens when you're under pre-clearance, doesn't work. So getting rid of the key clause is what the Roberts Court did. What they argued, I grew up Baptist, and they used to say, Lord, I wish I had a praying church. Because right now, what they argued was that racism was no longer a force in American society.
Right.
And I was like,
it had been defeated.
Yeah, I mean, it just wasn't where it was when the Voting Rights Act was there. Look, we've got all of these Black elected officials. We have all of these Hispanic elected officials. Racism really isn't that thing anymore.
The President of the United States was a Black man. What do you want?
See? Well, and to make that statement, they had to ignore that in the 2006 reauthorization, that the U.S. Department of Justice had presented to Congress over 700 proposed changes to the voting laws that the DOJ had blocked because they were racially discriminatory.
Yeah.
And this isn't since 1965. These were the changes since 1982.
Mm-hmm.
So
that's called evidence.
It's called evidence. And so you got judges ignoring evidence. It's like, wow.
Yeah.
Roberts and the other four, including Clarence Thomas,
mm-hmm.
argued that the Voting Rights Act picked on the South.
Yeah, right.
That it unduly singled out the South, and that just wasn't fair. Mm-hmm. That also required the court to ignore that there had been bail-in clauses in the Voting Rights Act. Mm-hmm. So there were areas in California, areas in New York, areas in Arizona that had been bailed in because
they got down to particular districts, didn't it?
Yes, because it was clear that there was something really wrong happening in those districts.
Yeah.
And Roberts argued that the law was basically calcified because there are only 17 districts have been bailed out since 1965. And so he's saying clearly nothing is moving here because this law is so horrible, so static, that the dynamism in these places cannot be recognized. Well, no, that requires, again, that you ignore over 700 proposed changes. And I look at that going, if only 17 districts could be bailed out, could that possibly mean that they're still discriminating or trying to discriminate? Because the law said, if you don't discriminate for 5 years, or as I call it, don't act a fool for 5 years.
Go be nice for 5 years and you'll be okay. You know?
Right.
They'll take you out of detention.
Yes, and they couldn't do it. And so based on not looking at evidence, based on not understanding that without the protections of the Voting Rights Act, it was Katie bar the door.
Right. And Roberts' majority now unleashed overnight, wasn't it? Texas only took hours?
2 hours.
2 hours? And Alabama only a day or two or something?
Alabama was coming in right behind them. North Carolina,
their voter ID laws that they'd already written.
Right, and so the voter ID law in Texas, so voter ID is based on the lie of voter fraud, right? The kind of lie that Kid Bond and company were telling in Missouri, and they had continued to manufacture the lie of voter fraud because they know that Americans want to protect democracy. So they swaddled this lie in the flag. What happened with voter fraud? A law professor out of California, Justin Levitt, he counted up the votes from 2000 to 2014. There were 1 billion votes cast in the United States in elections during that time. There were 31 cases of voter impersonation fraud. 31 out of 1 billion. As a historian, where I don't deal with a lot of numbers, I know that that's not significant. You know? Right.
No,
so
it's I mean,
bailing
out the ocean. I mean, it's insane.
So, but on this lie, they crafted these laws and they made it seem very reasonable, just like the Mississippi plan.
Yeah.
Because everybody has an ID. That's the kind of sentiment. Everybody has an ID. So it's not too onerous to ask you to show your ID. But they looked at the data about who had what types of ID and then made access to the ballot box based on those disparities.
Your chapter on voter ID is so important for this reason, because most people think an ID, well, I got IDs in my pocket. What's the big deal? I have a driver's license. What's the big deal? I have this, I have that. I have a hunter's license. What's the big deal? But large percentages of people don't have driver's license, don't have government issued IDs. And in some of these states, they defined which IDs were acceptable in ways that could almost guarantee a 10 or 15% decrease in that vote, right? I mean, it's like a predetermined way of.
Absolutely. Let's take Alabama.
Yeah.
So what Alabama did says, well, you got to have a government issued photo ID.
Mm-hmm.
So the NAACP Legal Defense Fund looked at that and said, wait a minute. You don't have public housing ID on your list of acceptable government issued photo IDs.
Mm-hmm.
Now, Alabama's a poor state, and 71% of those in public housing in Alabama are African American.
Mm-hmm.
For many, the Legal Defense Fund found it's the only ID they have. They don't have driver's licenses. Many don't have because cars are expensive. So Alabama looked at that and said, no, public housing ID is not an acceptable form of government issued photo ID. Right. But does it get more government issued than public housing?
You know, and for Americans right now who are struggling, and some are, to understand structural racism, there are many kinds of it. But just look at this one example. You want to move black people out of voting? Vast majority of people in public housing are black. Don't let them use that ID. Bingo. Yeah, I mean, that's a piece of structure right there. There are thousands of others, but anyway, the voter ID phenomenon is just remarkable, and they went to incredible extents. And it's all about eliminating maybe 8 or 10%, isn't it?
Well,
that's all it takes.
They have run the numbers.
Yeah.
And they have figured out you shave off some here, you shave off some there. And just like the Mississippi plan, right. What they do in the Mississippi plan is that if the poll tax didn't get them, the literacy test would. If the literacy test didn't get them, the good character clause would. The good character clause didn't get them, then the understanding clause would. The understanding clause didn't get them, then the grandfather clause would. So if this one, so how many hurdles do you have to go over? It's the same thing when we look at the array of voter suppression techniques now. If voter ID doesn't get you, then poll closures will. If poll closures won't get you, then voter roll purges will. If voter roll purges doesn't get you, then gerrymandering. If gerrymandering doesn't get you, I mean, it's just boom, 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 boom.
And restricting early voting or restricting numbers of polls. And
exactly.
I mean, lots of states have done this. And I wanted to stress too, while we have time here, that this is not now just a Southern phenomenon.
Oh, no.
You have great stuff in this book on Indiana, on Wisconsin, and other places, particularly Wisconsin. You want to reflect on Wisconsin just a bit? I mean, it's a great example here, and there's evidence out there. In fact, Ari Berman wrote an essay that you cite that argues that voter suppression won Wisconsin for Trump.
Yes, it did. It did. So what happened? What you're seeing here is how this has metastasized.
Yeah.
Throughout the United States, particularly in Republican-controlled states where you have a Republican governor and a Republican-controlled legislature. And it's metastasized through an organization that Paul Weyrich, remember, I don't want everybody to vote. Yeah. Our leverage goes up as the voting populace goes down. He had an organization called ALEC. And ALEC drafted the legislation that then got handed out to all of these Republicans. And so we see it creeping up all across the nation. What happened in Wisconsin with this legislation is they implemented a voter ID law. And then Governor Scott Walker, for fiscal reasons, because you want your government to be fiscally responsible, begins to shut down the Department of Motor Vehicles in Milwaukee. He begins to—
just a budget cut operation, just a budget cut.
Budget cut, right? Begins to move them and begins to restrict their hours. So when you are requiring an ID, and you have run the numbers to know that many African Americans in Milwaukee do not have a driver's license. Yeah. And then you begin to cut down and cauterize access to the place where you can get that ID. Meanwhile, they opened up additional Department of Motor Vehicles in rural areas and in the white suburbs. So this is how, all in the language of voter fraud, protecting, voter fraud, we got to stop voter fraud. What happened then in Milwaukee is that in 2016, there were 60,000 fewer votes cast
Mm-hmm.
in 2016 than there were in 2012. 68% of that drop happened in Milwaukee alone.
Hmm. And didn't Trump win that state by 20,000 or something, or
Yes,
30,000?
yes,
Yeah.
yes. I mean, so when you're looking at this, and scholars have gone in, and what they have found is that voter ID blocked about 8% of whites from voting.
Yeah.
It blocked over 25% of African Americans from voting in 2016.
Yeah.
Voter suppression has real consequences.
Indeed. You know, I want to do two more things with you. I want to bring us up to this current moment we're living, but I can't help this quote, because I have been saying for a long time now on this issue that I've yet to hear one Republican actually stand up and admit what they're doing, except you do quote one who admits this, but in a kind of haphazard way. His name is Todd Albaugh from Wisconsin. He was a Republican state senator in Wisconsin, and he's commenting when the Republicans in their state legislature passed this voter ID bill, he calls them giddy with celebration, and he's appalled at his fellow Republicans. He says, quote, GOP senators were giddy, literally. He says, literally, singled out. They had singled out the prospects of suppressing minority and college voters, as though he's astonished. Think about that a minute, he says. Elected officials planning and happy to deny a fellow American's constitutional right in order to increase their own chances of hanging on to power. This has to be a man. I mean, I'll give him credit. He admits it. It has to be a man who knows no history. None. He's astonished that they've just done this.
Right. And you know, but so
he's embarrassed, I guess.
But you think about how so much of our history is wrapped in a mythologized narrative.
Yeah.
That that can reduce slavery to a benign institution, that can make Jim Crow all about white only and colored only signs, and you take the signs down and everything's fine.
Right.
Yeah.
Oh my goodness. Well, Carol, this is impossible to answer in a short way, but here we are. I mean, and we should do another podcast in a month, depending on where this history goes that we're living. But we are, of course, 1 week, when we're taping this, 1 week into the protest, the outrage over recent police killings, especially the George Floyd case. None of us have seen this kind of public resistance, outrage, protest, really in 50 years. I guess I want to hear your thoughts, because it's a particular acts of my own. How in the world can this rage, this anger across the country now be somehow harnessed into this issue you and I have been talking about, into voting, into political organizing, into taking back power? Because if we don't, you know, as students of history, we know a lot about where rage ends up going. If it can't be harnessed into politics, it goes in all the wrong places. What are your thoughts on that at this point?
My thoughts is that I've been actually heartened by what I've seen, which is that folks aren't making that false binary between protest and politics, but seeing that the power of protest and the power of politics, the power of voting, both must be done. Yeah. And that this protest is helping to craft a vision of what we could be. Yeah. And then taking that vision and using it in the electoral realm so that we're not dealing with the violence that is raining down on people, the inability to master the tools that are at hand to stop a coronavirus wiping out over 100,000 Americans, the dismantling of the tools that were in place not only for the pandemic, but to deal with these police brutality. The DOJ had the plan. It was there. There were consent decrees, and this current regime just dismantled that and went to the remilitarization of the police. So
right back we were before Ferguson, which is now, in this particular historical moment, is a long time ago. I mean, there's so much that's going down.
But I think what makes this feel so different as well is the reality of a regime that has always, its legitimacy has always been questioned, and that it hasn't felt the need to prove its legitimacy. Instead, it has doubled down on its racism, on its xenophobia, on its brutality, on its cruelty. And so that it has just ripped open the lives of so many people who prior to hadn't been paying close attention to what the government does. But this regime does not allow you to not pay attention.
I hope you're right. I think you are right, but I hope you're right, because, and of course, we're going to have to try to have an election in what will still be some stage of a pandemic. We will be needing to vote in new ways, unusual ways, by mailing ballots if we can. And that, of course, has been utterly and completely weaponized as a political issue by Trump. I agree with you that Trump and Trumpism is the template on which these protests are happening. My only wish is that there were more signs saying vote. There are millions of signs out there right now, and I just keep looking for, here and there I've seen one, but not that many. I did notice yesterday that George Floyd's brother, got up to speak at this makeshift memorial they've established. It was very moving. He just started shouting to people, vote, vote, vote. And I thought, my God, God bless him.
And you think about it, that 2018 midterm.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
That 2018 midterm.
That's a marker. It really is.
The highest voter turnout since 1914 in
an off-year election. Yeah.
That is the momentum that is moving it. And people are really clear. They're not going to let a pandemic stop them. They're not going to let, as people have said, I will crawl through broken glass.
Right.
That's the determination. And that's what's got them even more afraid.
And it does seem that people are now energized by voting against something as much as they are voting for something. And that's frankly always been the history of politics. It is partly about knowing what you're voting against as much as what you're voting for.
And the Republicans made deliberate choices. They made those choices when they opted to not deal with reform of the party, but opted to deal with suppression. When they ignored the autopsy after Mitt Romney's defeat, that said we really have got to broaden our base, and instead
they went their fate.
Yeah. Right.
They invented Donald Trump. They enabled Donald Trump. They have invented their fate. We just have to, I want to leave our audience here with one last little tribute to you, if I can, and it's a phrase you haven't booked. You call voting a talisman of humanity. Lots of people call voting the sacred right. They call it, it is, and we have all sorts of the highest of our liberties and so on and so on. A talisman of humanity, and I love the phrase because I think it does come from the depth of this kind of history. It's a talisman of humanity for those using it who were deemed for so long not essentially human.
Yeah.
And voting is a public demonstration of one's humanity. I've always felt that way. Going to vote is still, to me, an exciting kind of thing. I always come back and put my little sticker that says "I vote," like on a mirror or on something. But it's a great phrase. I like that. I don't know if you borrowed it from somebody or you invented it, but I'm giving you credit for it.
Thank you.
Great line. Listen, this has been great, and if you don't mind being invited back, I'd like to do that. We should update this podcast in a month or two and see where we are. Maybe around the time of the conventions or something. I'd love to do it again.
Definitely, I would love that. I would love.
Carol, thank you. This has been fascinating. We could go on all day, but we can't. So thanks for doing this, and I'll see you on the next one.
Okay, thank you, David.
Bye-bye. Thank you. As always, the Gilder Lehrman Center welcomes contributions from those who support our work and our mission. To give, please go to the link in the event invitation, visit the GLC web page, and click on Donate, or email the Gilder Lehrman Center for more information. The Gilder Lehrman Center is conducting a widespread fundraising campaign to sustain all of the activities we do in the coming years, and we welcome any help you can give us. Thank you very much.